February 11th, 1979, started like any other morning in Hana, a quiet and isolated town on the northeastern coast of Maui. The sun rose over lush cliffs and cascading waterfalls, painting the small town in golden light. At just over a few hundred residents, Hana had the feel of stepping back in time, a place untouched by the hustle and bustle of the rest of the island. For Ralph Malayakini, 27, the day had begun normally. He had breakfast with his family, checked his tools, and prepared to meet his coworker, Pat Wessner, for a day of construction work. Outside, the temperature was a comfortable 70 degrees, with barely a hint of wind. The sky stretched clear and blue above, a rare blessing for a place surrounded by unpredictable waters. As Ralph drove through the winding roads of Hana, the famous Hana Highway, a twisting 50-mile ribbon of pavement, he glanced at Hana Bay. The water was unusually calm, sparkling in the morning sun. Ralph felt the familiar pull of the ocean. Work could wait. Fishing was calling. He turned his truck around and went to round up his friends, Pat Wessner, Peter Hanchett, Benny Kalama, and Scott Mormon. All men were in their 20s and 30s, strong and experienced, accustomed to life near the ocean. They shared the kind of friendship forged in small towns, deep, enduring, and unshakable. Ralph then drove to his twin brother Robert's house. Robert owned a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe, a sturdy, bright blue fishing boat. It wasn't flashy, just a standard vessel with a steering wheel, CB radio, and a backup engine. Yet the boat was advertised as unsinkable, and Robert trusted it enough to let Ralph borrow it any time. The boat's name was a combination of their parents' names, a small personal touch in an otherwise practical life. After a quick conversation with Robert, Ralph hitched the Sarah Joe to his truck and went to the general store to meet the others. Along the way, he picked up essential supplies, bags of ice, drinks, and a few spark plugs. The day's goal was ambitious but familiar: catch large ulua fish, sometimes weighing nearly 300 pounds, some to sell to the local store, and the rest for family and friends. By just before 10 in the morning, the 5 friends were aboard the Sarah Joe, leaving Hana Bay with laughter and anticipation. Ralph steered the boat toward a fishing spot he had found rewarding in the past, far enough from the shore to escape the shallows, but within reach of the bountiful waters. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The ocean lay smooth beneath them. The sky stretched clear overhead. Conversations flowed freely, punctuated by the occasional shout as someone spotted a fish or joked about past trips. Yet Hana's calm waters could be deceiving. The Alanuhihala Channel, which separated Maui from the neighboring islands, was notorious for violent swells and fierce currents. Deep beneath the surface, the Hawaiian Trough plunged to nearly 20,000 feet, while above, winds could rise across the Pacific with little warning. Experienced sailors knew that the ocean, even on its calmest day, could turn deadly in moments. As the boat drifted farther from the coast, the subtle signs of change began. A distant line of clouds appeared on the horizon, a faint shadow against the bright sky. The wind, previously gentle, began to shift slightly, whispering hints of danger. In Hana, the weather report system was limited. Radio signals covered only larger towns, and local stations rarely broadcast warnings for the small bay. Even if the men had known a storm might approach, it wouldn't have deterred them. The channel was perilous almost every day, yet fishermen ventured out regardless. By early afternoon, the changes became undeniable. The wind strengthened, waves rose steadily, and the horizon darkened as clouds grew heavier. The calm, perfect morning was giving way to a growing storm, one that would test every skill the men possessed. Back in Hana, residents began to notice the shift. Rain clouds thickened, and gusts rattled the roofs of old plantation homes. 3 larger fishing boats returned from their trips, their crews pale and shaken as they described a rising storm like nothing they had seen. One man recalled waves lifting his boat nearly vertically, a terrifying spectacle of nature's raw power. Yet the Sarah Joe had not returned. Concern grew rapidly into fear. By late afternoon, family members and friends gathered along the shoreline, scanning the turbulent water for any sign of the small vessel. When night fell, darkness and the continuing storm made it nearly impossible to see anything. The boat, the men, the morning laughter, it was all swallowed by the vast, angry ocean. A distress call had reportedly been picked up by a local radio hobbyist, though the Coast Guard later denied receiving any official signal. Even so, the tension in the small town was palpable. The 5 men were strong, experienced, and familiar with the ocean, but the scale of the storm was something that could overwhelm even the most capable sailors. As darkness settled over Hana Bay, the search officially began. Helicopters struggled through low visibility, and local fishermen braved dangerous waves, hoping for a miracle. But for the night, the Sarah Joe was gone, and the ocean held its secrets tightly, as if erasing all traces of the day's events. The calm of the morning had vanished. The adventure that had begun in laughter and optimism was now a desperate test against nature, one that would soon make the disappearance of 5 men a mystery that haunted Hana for decades.
The morning calm did not last. By midday, the ocean began to whisper warnings that the 5 friends could not ignore. From the horizon, a line of dark clouds slowly crept forward, their edges jagged and ominous against the bright Hawaiian sun. The wind shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough to ripple the water in subtle, unnatural ways. Experienced fishermen like Ralph felt the unease immediately. Ralph glanced around the Sarah Joe. Pat, Benny, Peter, and Scott were busy baiting hooks and preparing lines, unaware of the subtle change in the water. But Ralph's instincts told him the sea was no longer forgiving. For 2 hours, the ocean had been a gentle companion. Now it was a restless force, quietly gathering strength for a display that no human could control. The first gusts of wind began teasing the boat, lifting it slightly on the rolling swells. Each wave was a reminder that the waters off Hana were not ordinary. The Alanuihaha Channel was infamous for storms that could turn small boats into toys in minutes, and the men now faced one of the most dangerous storms the island had seen in years. The sky darkened rapidly. Sunlight, once warm and comforting, now struggled through layers of heavy clouds. The ocean, previously shimmering, turned slate gray, its surface jagged with growing swells. A sudden drop in temperature cut through the men's clothing, sending a chill down their spines. The calm morning had been a ruse, nature's deceptive serenity. Ralph knew it was time to head back. He turned the wheel, guiding the Sarah Joe toward the coast, but the sea had other plans. Waves began rising higher, catching the small boat in steep troughs. Each swell lifted the vessel as though it were weightless, only to slam it back down with violent force. Water splashed over the sides, soaking the men and threatening to destabilize the boat entirely. By 1 o'clock, the storm had fully arrived. Winds picked up to gale force, blowing relentlessly across the surface of the Pacific. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the men, freezing them, and further reducing visibility. The sky was a uniform gray, blending with the ocean in a disorienting haze. Even the horizon disappeared. Back in Hana, residents noticed the storm's sudden ferocity. Trees bent under the wind's assault, and the roofs of old plantation homes rattled like drums. At Hana Bay, worried family members gathered along the shoreline, scanning the rough waters. The first 3 fishing boats returned, their crews pale and shaken. One fisherman described seeing the ocean as a river in turmoil, waves as high as buildings, moving with a force that made navigation nearly impossible. The Sarah Joe was still out there, caught in the growing chaos. The men struggled to maintain control, battling both waves and wind. Each wave threatened to roll the small boat completely, and the engine struggled against the force of the storm. Rain stung their faces, and the sound of thunder and roaring surf made shouting nearly impossible. Every movement required precision. A single mistake could tip the boat, sweeping them into the relentless sea. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of slowing. Ralph, Pat, Peter, Benny, and Scott clung to the boat, hearts pounding, muscles burning. The promise of a calm day had vanished. In its place was raw, unrelenting power, a test of endurance and luck. Every moment was a battle, balancing the boat, bailing water, steering through impossible conditions. At some point, the men likely realized the severity of their situation. Even the strongest swimmers would have struggled in these conditions. Yet the small boat kept fighting against the waves, bobbing, rising, falling, a fragile silhouette in a sea of chaos. In Hana, by evening, concern turned to panic. When the Sarah Joe failed to return, authorities were alerted. The Coast Guard scrambled to launch a search, but darkness and the storm's fury made their efforts nearly impossible. Helicopters fought the wind, skimming above the massive swells, eyes straining for a glimmer of the missing vessel. Even if the Sarah Joe had been visible from above, it would have been swallowed by shadows and water. Local fishermen refused to wait. Some launched into the storm despite the danger, determined to find their friends. Among them was Peter's father, navigating through the waves that seemed intent on overturning his boat. Hours later, when he returned empty-handed, his description of the conditions chilled the town. Waves had lifted his boat nearly vertical. Swells were so massive that even a vessel only 50 yards away could be completely hidden. Night fell. Rain and wind continued with equal intensity. Visibility was near zero, and the ocean raged like an unthinking beast. Somewhere in that darkness, the Sarah Joe fought against nature, tossed by waves, slipping beneath the surface of the mighty Pacific. Whether the men were still aboard, clinging to hope, or already lost to the depths, no one could know. The storm passed eventually, leaving behind an uneasy calm. The waters that had promised a fun day of fishing now seemed indifferent to human struggle. The small fishing boat had vanished, swallowed by the ocean and hidden from view. The men, whose fate unknown, became ghosts on the Pacific, their laughter and voices carried away by the wind and waves. In the days that followed, the story of the Sarah Jo would dominate the town. Families and friends questioned how a small boat, piloted by strong, experienced men, could disappear without a trace. The storm had been merciless, a reminder that the ocean is both provider and destroyer. And for Hannah, the morning that began so peacefully was now remembered as the day the sea took hold of 5 lives, leaving behind only mystery, fear, and unanswered questions.
By the next morning, Hannah Bay had transformed into a scene of tension and anxiety. Families lined the shoreline, their eyes scanning the restless ocean for the tiniest hint of the Sarah Jo. Boats of every size, from small personal vessels to larger commercial craft, readied themselves to join the search. The town's tight-knit community mobilized almost instinctively. In Hannah, everyone knew someone on that boat, and for the people there, waiting idly was not an option. The Coast Guard had been alerted, and helicopters lifted into the sky despite the lingering rough winds. The search area was enormous. The Pacific stretched endlessly, and the small, bright blue Sarah Jo was a needle in a vast, violent haystack. Even from the air, spotting it seemed nearly impossible. Clouds still lingered, the water churned with angry swells, and rain-slick surfaces reflected little light, hiding every detail from the search crews. Local families did not wait for official instructions. Men and women with boats navigated the swells, risking their own lives to locate loved ones. Others walked miles along the coastline, searching every accessible point where the missing men could have reached shore. Every wave that struck the cliffs, every rock along the bay was scrutinized with hope and dread mingled together. Among those leading the effort were family members themselves. Peter Hanchett's father, determined and fearless, pushed his small craft into the open channel. He had faced strong currents before, but nothing like this. The waves lifted the boat almost vertically, forcing him to fight for every inch. Rain and wind battered him relentlessly, yet he refused to turn back. Each moment was a desperate struggle against both nature and time. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard expanded its search dramatically. Multiple aircraft flew over the area, covering thousands of square miles. They crisscrossed the ocean in methodical patterns, trying to spot the small blue hull among the waves. But the ocean's vastness, combined with the lingering effects of the storm, meant that every flight brought back frustratingly little information. Back on land, the mood was a mixture of hope and creeping dread. The town of Hannah, usually quiet and undisturbed, now buzzed with activity. Phones rang incessantly, rumors spread quickly, and anxiety hung over every household. Every splash in the water, every shadow on the horizon, was analyzed with intense focus, only to bring disappointment time and again. Days stretched into a week, and the search grew more desperate. Even after the storm had passed, the ocean seemed to keep its secrets close. Families of the missing men became convinced that their loved ones were somewhere out there, perhaps injured or stranded, awaiting rescue. But as each day passed without sight of the boat or crew, despair began to creep in. The Coast Guard faced scrutiny. Some locals accused them of moving too slowly or failing to consider how the strong northerly winds could have carried the Sarah Jo far from its expected path. The official stance was that the search had been thorough, constrained only by weather conditions and the limits of technology at the time. But from the perspective of the families, every delay, every mischance seemed like a lost opportunity. Despite the growing frustration, Hannah's residents refused to give up. Private planes joined the search alongside Coast Guard aircraft, scanning the vast ocean with binoculars and cameras. Local boat owners volunteered their time and vessels, combing every accessible stretch of water. It was a community effort unlike any other in the island's history, driven by love, loyalty, and desperation. Meanwhile, the missing men remained invisible to all efforts. The Sarah Jo, small and bright blue, could have been tossed anywhere by the storm, toward the deep channel, along the coast, or into the open Pacific entirely. The vastness of the ocean and the ferocity of the storm meant that even a brief moment of disorientation could have led to disaster. Search teams found small pieces of debris, a life jacket here, a floating cooler there, but nothing that definitively indicated the location of the Sarah Jo or its crew. Each sighting that might have been a clue ultimately ended in disappointment, and with every passing day, the probability of survival decreased in the minds of everyone involved. By the 5th day, the official search had reached its limits. The Coast Guard, after hundreds of hours of flying over tens of thousands of square miles, called off the active search. For families, this pronouncement was crushing. They had already risked so much, and now they were being told that the men were likely gone, lost to the ocean forever. Yet Hannah's residents could not accept this conclusion. The town's unity and resilience were unwavering. Families pooled resources to hire additional private boats and even more aircraft. Donations poured in from friends, neighbors, and strangers who felt the pull of human tragedy. Boats scoured every accessible area, while volunteers patrolled the shoreline,
hoping for a sign, anything that might indicate survival or wreckage. Even after weeks of effort, no definitive answers emerged. The town held vigils, searched tirelessly, and kept hope alive through community strength. But as days turned into months, reality began to settle in. The missing men were not returning, and the ocean had claimed them in ways that no one could fully comprehend. Still, the search left behind a legacy of courage, determination, and community solidarity. Hana, small and remote as it was, had demonstrated a commitment to its own, a willingness to confront nature's indifference with human resolve. And even as uncertainty hung heavy over the bay, the story of the Sarah Joe, its crew, and the relentless search would remain etched in the memories of everyone who had participated. The mystery had deepened. The men were gone, the boat was missing, and the ocean had swallowed more than just wood and metal. It had swallowed certainty, leaving only questions. Where had the Sarah Joe gone? Were any of the men still alive when the storm ended? And if not, what had become of them in the vast Pacific expanse? The answers would not come easily, and in many ways they would not come at all, at least not for years. And so Hana waited, gripped by grief, hope, and the haunting knowledge that the Pacific held secrets far beyond human reach.
Nearly 10 years had passed since the Sarah Joe vanished off Hana Bay. The small town of Hana had gradually tried to heal, but the disappearance of Ralph, Pat, Peter, Benny, and Scott had left a wound that time could never fully close. Memorials had been held, stories shared, and families tried to move forward, but the ocean's silence remained a constant reminder of the unknown. Far from Maui, over 2,300 miles southwest in the remote Marshall Islands, a team of researchers disembarked on Sibilla Island, part of the Taongi Atoll. The island was scarcely more than a sandbar, 3 miles long, 1,000 feet wide at its widest point, and rising only a few feet above the sea. Vegetation clung stubbornly to the center, but the shores were barren, pounded by sun and salt, inhospitable to most wildlife. Sea turtles nested in the sand, and seabirds occasionally rested, but humans rarely tread here. For the research team commissioned by the Marshallese government to evaluate islands for potential wildlife sanctuaries, Sibilla was barely noteworthy. As the scientists began their survey, one of them noticed an unusual shape partially buried in the sand, a fragment of something man-made. At first glance, it looked like debris washed ashore, but closer inspection revealed it was a fiberglass hull, battered yet unmistakably shaped like a small fishing boat. Its faded blue paint was reminiscent of vessels common in Hawaii. Curiosity piqued, the researcher approached cautiously. The hull's registration number was partially legible, HA, unmistakably Hawaiian. But what was a small Hawaiian fishing boat doing thousands of miles from home, stranded on a nearly uninhabited island? Moving around the hull, the researcher noticed letters that seemed familiar, SAHJ. The memory struck immediately, a search 9 years prior for a boat that vanished during a storm off Maui. Could it be the Sarah Joe? Every detail matched. The shape of the boat, the paint, the letters, all suggested the improbable. A fishing boat lost in a violent storm had somehow drifted across the Pacific and ended up on Sibilla Island. But the discovery became more horrifying. Inside the hull, amid faded blue paint and chipped fiberglass, lay human bones. The initial shock was immediate, not just the realization that someone had perished, but the uncanny improbability of finding these remains in such a remote location. The researcher, John Naughton, took careful notes and began mapping the surrounding area. Nearby, he spotted a crude cross fashioned from driftwood, partially buried in the sand. At its base were flat coral shingles and a small stack of paper interlaced with metallic sheets, a possible ceremonial arrangement. Sitting atop the pile was a human jawbone, teeth marked with fillings that could one day help identify the deceased. At first, the age of the bones puzzled John. They appeared relatively fresh, not weathered by the elements for nearly a decade. Some might have been exposed for only a few years, suggesting that death had not occurred immediately during the 1979 storm. This discrepancy hinted at a story more complex than anyone could have imagined. Other items on the island reinforced the connection to the missing fishing trip: a styrofoam cooler, glass fishing floats, and other small debris consistent with the Sarah Joe's journey. Yet their placement was peculiar. While the hull rested on the lagoon side of the island, most debris had washed up along the ocean-facing shore. Something had moved the boat deliberately, or currents had performed an extraordinary trick. Either way, it added a layer of mystery. Recognizing the gravity of the find, John notified authorities. The Coast Guard arranged for a forensic team to travel to Sibilla. Specialists from the Army Identification Lab arrived, confirming the hull's identity as the Sarah Joe through its manufacturer's number. Dental records were then used to identify the skeletal remains. Astonishingly, all bones recovered belonged to Scott Mormon, one of the 5 missing friends. The discovery reopened the case and posed new questions. How had Scott ended up alone on Sibilla? Were the others lost at sea, or had they also somehow reached land? Who buried him, and why had no previous research teams noticed the wreck or the grave in prior surveys? Evidence suggested human intervention in the burial. The square papers resembled Taiwanese funeral customs, in which the deceased are interned with a stack of paper, sometimes with metallic sheets, burned as part of the ceremony.
The driftwood cross had nails typical of fishing boats, indicating that someone with maritime knowledge had handled the body. Steve Goodenow, later hired as a private investigator by the families, theorized that passing fishermen, likely in the area illegally, had found Scott and performed the burial without reporting it. Yet many questions remained. The bone's relative freshness challenged the assumption that Scott had perished immediately during the storm. If the boat had drifted across the Pacific for 2 to 3 months as theorized, what had become of Scott during that time? Could he have survived temporarily on another island before reaching Sibylla, only to succumb to dehydration or starvation later? The placement of the hull and debris also confounded investigators. If currents alone had carried the boat, why was it positioned on the lagoon side while floating debris rested on the ocean side? Was someone guiding the vessel? Theories could only speculate, but no definitive answers existed. The discovery reignited public interest. Hana's small town, which had mourned quietly for nearly a decade, now saw their tragedy gain attention far beyond Maui. Television crews, including a team from Unsolved Mysteries, arrived to document the story, reenacting the disappearance and search for viewers nationwide. Residents recounted the storm, the frantic search, and the months of heartbreak, bringing the haunting tale to a larger audience. The story of the Sarah Jo had taken an unexpected turn. What was once a simple disappearance had transformed into an international mystery. A small fishing boat, lost in a storm, had drifted across the Pacific. One man's remains were discovered, seemingly buried by unknown hands. The rest of the crew remained missing, their fate a permanent void in the story. The decade-long silence of the ocean had been broken. But even as investigators pieced together the fragments of evidence, the answers remained incomplete. Sibylla Island held its secrets. Scott's journey, the movement of the hull, and the mystery of the other men's fate were riddles that time alone could not solve. For Hana, the discovery was bittersweet. The return of a single friend's remains provided closure, yet reopened old wounds. Families could mourn properly, but questions linger in every conversation, in every wave that lapped against Hana's shores. The ocean had spoken, but only partially. Its full story remained untold, leaving humanity to confront the limits of knowledge against the vast, indifferent Pacific.
With the discovery of the Sarah Jo and Scott's remains, the story of the missing fishing boat had entered a new, puzzling chapter. Yet while one piece of the mystery was uncovered, countless questions remained unanswered. For Hana and the families, relief and grief now coexisted. Scott could finally be laid to rest, but the fate of Ralph, Pat, Peter, and Benny remained unknown. Investigators, led by private investigator Steve Goodenow, returned to the scene of the discovery. They meticulously documented the hull, the grave, and surrounding debris. The findings suggested one possibility. After the storm's fury tossed the Sarah Jo off course, it had drifted thousands of miles across the Pacific, subjected entirely to the mercy of currents and wind. But drifting alone could not explain everything. The condition of Scott's bones posed the first challenge. Forensic experts determined they had been exposed to the elements for only a few years, not the nearly decade-long period since the storm. This implied Scott had survived somewhere else for a time, or perhaps his remains were moved after initially washing ashore. If he had survived the ocean journey for months, how did he manage it with minimal supplies? Could he have collected rainwater, caught fish, or found temporary refuge on an uninhabited island? No evidence of long-term survival, such as fire pits or temporary shelters, was found, leaving only speculation. The burial itself added another layer of mystery. The driftwood cross, the flat coral shingles, and the stack of square papers interwoven with metallic sheets mirrored Taiwanese funeral customs. Investigators theorized that fishermen who were illegally operating in the area may have discovered Scott's body and conducted the burial themselves. Nails found in the cross were consistent with those used on commercial fishing vessels, lending credibility to the theory. But why was the grave so precise? Why not leave Scott exposed or report the discovery? Fear of legal repercussions, given the fishermen's illegal presence, seemed likely, but this remained speculative. Another puzzle was the boat's final resting place. The hull lay on the lagoon side of Sibylla Island, while smaller debris rested on the ocean side. Ocean currents alone would normally deposit all floating objects in roughly the same area. The separation suggested human intervention, yet navigating a vessel through the narrow lagoon opening would have been difficult without skill or knowledge of local conditions. Was the boat deliberately moved after washing ashore, or did the currents perform a miraculous, highly improbable maneuver? Investigators could not say. Steve Goodenow attempted to reconstruct the final journey. Based on ocean current data and storm patterns from 1979, he estimated the Sarah Jo drifted west-southwest for approximately 2 to 3 months before reaching the vicinity of Sibylla Island. This placed Scott in a prolonged period of exposure at sea. If he was alone on the boat, as the evidence suggested, survival for months with limited water and food would have been nearly impossible. Yet the human body is unpredictable, and some accounts of open ocean survival defy conventional expectation. Could Scott have endured clinging to life only to die near the island? The fate of the remaining 4 men remains a haunting mystery. No other bones, personal items, or wreckage have ever surfaced. Were they thrown from the boat by the storm's colossal waves? Did they reach another island only to perish? The Pacific's vastness is merciless, hiding countless secrets beneath its surface. Each unanswered question served as a reminder that not all tragedies yield clarity, even when partial evidence emerges. Community memories added depth to the mystery. Locals who had participated in the original search recalled the storm in vivid detail. Waves so high they seemed to reach the sky, winds that tore at boats, and rain so heavy it erased the horizon.
They remembered the frantic efforts to locate the men and the exhaustion that followed. Now, nearly a decade later, the discovery of Scott's remains validated their worst fears, while simultaneously deepening the enigma. Psychologically, the story left a mark not only on Hannah, but on anyone who studied it. The narrative was a grim lesson in human vulnerability against nature's overwhelming power. It highlighted how even skill, preparation, and community coordination could be insufficient against the raw forces of wind, wave, and current. Yet it also demonstrated resilience, the decades-long hope, the meticulous investigation, and the courage to confront impossible odds. Media attention, particularly the Unsolved Mysteries episode filmed in Hana, transformed the local tragedy into a story with global reach. The reenactments, interviews, and footage of the storm and subsequent searches introduced viewers to the brutal unpredictability of the Pacific. Still, no new leads emerged. The case became a symbol of maritime uncertainty, a cautionary tale about respect for the ocean's indifference. Several theories circulated among experts and locals alike. Some argued Scott had initially survived on another island before reaching Sibylla, explaining the shorter period of bone bleaching. Others suggested human intervention at some stage, either by fishermen or unknown individuals, could have altered the timeline and placement of the remains. A few speculated that Scott may have been alive when the Sarah Jo reached Sibylla, only to die there, leaving those who buried him as the final witnesses. Each theory had merit, yet none could fully reconcile all evidence. For the families, these theories provided both solace and torment. Scott's remains offered closure for one life, yet the ambiguity of the others' fates remained painful. Even today, decades later, Ralph, Peter, and Benny's families gather, sharing memories, stories, and grief. The ocean had taken their loved ones, and while Scott's journey ended in partial revelation, the larger story remained suspended in uncertainty. Ultimately, the Sarah Jo case stands as a testament to human perseverance and the ocean's unknowable nature. A tiny fishing boat, lost in a sudden storm, became a mystery spanning thousands of miles and a decade of unanswered questions. One man's remains were recovered, honoring a life lost at sea, while the rest remain hidden in the Pacific's immense expanse. Some questions may never be answered. Where did the remaining men perish? How did Scott's remains arrive on Sibylla? And who was responsible for the burial? Could the boat itself have drifted without human help into such a precise location? These mysteries linger, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, echoing across the ocean like the faint, fading cries of a storm long past. Even as the families mourn, investigators study, and the public wonders, the story of the Sarah Jo endures, a haunting reminder of nature's power, the fragility of life, and the enduring human need to search, hope, and remember.